In 1983, in the heart of America, a year when small towns still felt safe and parents trusted their children could walk the streets without fear, shadows began to move quietly, unseen. This is a story about trust betrayed, innocence stolen, and a young man who hid behind the uniform of honor while carrying the darkest of secrets. He was bright, polite, and admired in his community. A Boy Scout, a neighbor, a son. But beneath the surface lay urges he could not control, urges that would transform him from a promising young man into a name whispered with horror. Parents sent their children outside to play, never suspecting that danger wore the smile of a scout leader. And in 1983, fear crept into the quiet streets of Nebraska, leaving families shattered and investigators chasing a phantom. This is not just the tale of crimes committed. It is the unraveling of a hidden life, the collapse of trust, and the chilling truth that even the most trusted symbols can mask unthinkable darkness. You are now listening to Sleeping Radio, where stories unfold slowly, like a dark dream, guiding you deeper into the mystery. Tonight, we bring you the haunting account of John Joseph Joubert, known to history as the Boy Scout Killer. It was the morning of September 18th, 1983, in Bellevue, Nebraska, a quiet suburban community just south of Omaha. The air was crisp with the change of seasons. For families living in this small town, Sundays meant calm routines. Children riding their bikes, neighbors greeting one another, and parents preparing for church or family gatherings. That morning, 13-year-old Danny Joe Eberly, a boy known for his polite manners and quiet determination, began his paper route. For him, it was more than a chore. It was his first taste of responsibility, a way to help his family and earn a little independence. He carried his bag filled with folded newspapers, setting out just as the sun began to rise. But Danny never finished his route. By mid-morning, worried phone calls reached the Eberly household. Several neighbors complained that they hadn't received their paper. His bicycle was later found abandoned, neatly propped up against a fence, as if someone had gently set it aside. The newspapers inside the delivery bag remained untouched. Panic spread quickly. Danny's family knew something was wrong. He was not the type to run away. He was dependable, trustworthy, the kind of boy who followed the rules. Within hours, the Bellevue police were notified, and what began as a missing child case soon escalated into a community-wide search. Volunteers, neighbors, and law enforcement scoured the streets, fields, and wooded areas near the boy's route. Helicopters circled overhead. Officers knocked on doors, hoping for a lead. Yet the trail was cold almost immediately. Danny had vanished without a sound, without a witness. Days passed. Fear grew heavier. Parents kept their children indoors. Streets once alive with laughter became silent. It was as if a shadow had settled over Bellevue, and no one could shake the uneasy feeling that something sinister was hiding in plain sight. On September 21st, just 3 days after Danny's disappearance, that fear turned to horror. A search team discovered a body in a rural area east of Bellevue. It was Danny. His body bore marks of a violent end. His hands had been bound with rope, and his chest carried multiple stab wounds. The innocence of Bellevue was shattered in that moment. The police now faced a terrifying truth. Someone had abducted, tortured, and murdered a child in their community. And that someone was still out there. Investigators worked tirelessly, collecting evidence from the scene. They noted the rope tied around Danny's wrists. The knots were tight, precise, and deliberate. An unsettling detail that suggested the killer had taken his time. No fingerprints were found. No witnesses came forward. The only clues were fibers, the rope, and the disturbing violence inflicted on the boy. The case drew statewide attention. Parents were terrified. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone. Paper routes were canceled, and fear became a constant companion in Bellevue. The police organized roadblocks, questioned known offenders, and reached out to the FBI for assistance. Yet, despite their efforts, the killer seemed invisible. What haunted the investigators most was the sheer boldness of the crime. This was not a random act of passion. It was methodical, calculated, and chillingly intimate. The boy had been taken in broad daylight from a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. Whoever had done this was not an outsider passing through. He was someone who blended in, someone the community might even trust. And indeed, the killer was close. Closer than anyone could imagine. While Bellevue mourned the loss of Danny Joe Eberly, the man responsible walked freely among them. To neighbors, he was polite, soft-spoken, and even respectable. Few would suspect that beneath the uniform of a Boy Scout leader lurked the mind of a predator. But the darkness was only beginning to surface. Danny would not be the last. The town of Bellevue was still shaken by the murder of young Danny Joe Eberly when, only 2 months later, darkness struck again. It was now December 2nd, 1983, the beginning of winter. The cold air carried with it the unease that never left after September's tragedy. Parents clutched their children more tightly, warning them not to stray too far. But for 12-year-old Christopher Walden, a bright, friendly boy who loved the outdoors, school, and his friends, life still carried the simplicity of childhood. That morning, Christopher set out for school. He wore his jacket against the December chill and walked along the familiar streets of Bellevue. It was a short walk, just a few blocks. Nothing unusual. Nothing that should have raised alarm. Yet Christopher never made it to school. When his absence was reported, panic spread instantly. The town could not believe it was happening again. First Danny, now Christopher. 2 boys, 2 vanishings, only months apart. Police officers flooded the area. They retraced his path, spoke to classmates, and checked every corner where a child might hide. The fear that had simmered since September now exploded into full terror. 5 days later, on December 7th, a hunter walking through a wooded area southeast of Bellevue made a grim discovery. Lying in the underbrush was Christopher's body. The details were almost identical to the earlier crime. His hands were bound with rope, tied in the same precise fashion as Danny's. His throat bore the brutal marks of stabbing and slashing. The similarities confirmed the police's worst fear. A serial predator was at work. Investigators immediately connected the cases: the rope, the binding, the methodical brutality. It was the same hand, the same cold precision. This was no coincidence. Bellevue, once a quiet and trusting community, was now the hunting ground of a killer who had struck twice within 3 months. The investigation intensified. Police searched for anyone who might have been in both crime areas. They questioned hundreds of residents, interviewed teachers, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen something. Still, no solid suspect emerged. What baffled the detectives most was the lack of witnesses. Both boys had disappeared during daylight, from residential areas where people were out and about. How could a predator snatch children in broad daylight without anyone noticing? It was as if the killer moved invisibly, blending into the fabric of the town. The FBI created a profile. The killer was likely a young man, intelligent, meticulous, and organized. Someone who could easily approach children without raising suspicion. Perhaps someone in a position of trust. That profile was closer to the truth than anyone realized. As Bellevue mourned Christopher's death, whispers spread among the townspeople. Rumors grew. Suspicion fell on neighbors, and trust dissolved. Parents no longer let their children play outside. Doors were locked earlier. The small Nebraska town lived in quiet fear. Yet, all the while, John Joseph Joubert, the true predator, continued his life unnoticed. By day, he was a seemingly ordinary young man. He worked, he smiled, he interacted politely with others, and in another part of his life, he wore the proud uniform of a Boy Scout leader, the very symbol of trustworthiness and honor. But beneath that image, inside his private thoughts, he carried violent compulsions he could not resist. To him, the murders were not random explosions of violence. They were carefully chosen acts, fulfilling urges he had battled since his teenage years. The rope, the knives, the rituals, they were all part of his hidden world, one no one around him could see. The deaths of Danny and Christopher left Bellevue terrified. But they also left a trail of evidence that investigators would later piece together. The rope, the knots, the patterns. Though they did not know it yet, these chilling details would eventually be the key to identifying the Boy Scout killer. For now, however, in December of 1983, the town lived in fear. The killer was free. The children were not safe. And the darkness was far from over. In 1984, Bellevue was still haunted by the unsolved murders of Danny Eberly and Christopher Walden. Families lived with constant caution, and children were rarely allowed to walk alone. Though the fear was heavy, the investigation had stalled. The killer had vanished as suddenly as he appeared, leaving only the echo of his violence. What the townspeople did not know was that their predator had quietly left Nebraska. His name was John Joseph Joubert, and his new path was already unfolding hundreds of miles away. At only 20 years old, Joubert joined the U.S. Air Force, beginning basic training that year. He was sent to a base in Maine, far from the quiet neighborhoods of Bellevue. On the surface, it seemed like a fresh start for a young man, an opportunity to discipline himself, to serve his country, and to bury the whispers of a troubled past. But the darkness that lived inside him did not stay behind. From childhood, Joubert had struggled with violent fantasies. As a teenager, he had already attacked other children with knives, testing the boundaries of his compulsions. He was intelligent, meticulous, and aware that something inside him was dangerously abnormal. Yet he could not control the urges. The killings in Nebraska had not satisfied him. They had awakened something deeper. Now, in Maine, in a new environment, the compulsions began to grow again. The structure of the military gave him order, but the secret world in his mind remained. He wore the uniform with pride, appearing to his peers as disciplined and focused. To his superiors, he was simply another young recruit, blending into the ranks. But in the quiet moments, Joubert stalked new hunting grounds. August 1984. In Portland, Maine, 11-year-old Richard Ricky Stetson went out for his usual jog. Ricky was athletic, cheerful, and well-liked. He jogged regularly across the Casco Bay Bridge, a familiar route he had taken many times before. That evening, he never returned home. When searchers found his body the next morning, the discovery was chilling. His hands bore small rope marks. His chest had stab wounds. And, most disturbingly, his body carried bite marks. The medical examiner noted that the teeth marks would later prove crucial. They were unusual, distinct, and unlike a typical adult's bite. Maine, just like Nebraska, now had a predator on its hands. And no one suspected that the man responsible for Bellevue's tragedies had relocated to their quiet state. Investigators in Maine were baffled. They studied the bite marks carefully, preserving dental impressions. They collected fibers, rope traces, and every scrap of physical evidence. Though the case gained attention, leads were scarce. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air after striking. Meanwhile, Joubert continued his double life. By day, he was a disciplined serviceman, earning the respect of his peers in the Air Force. By night, he fed his dark fantasies, reading crime stories, studying knots, and revisiting his private compulsions. He was both a soldier and a predator, two sides of a life that could not remain hidden forever. The link between Maine and Nebraska had not yet been made. The murders seemed worlds apart. Different states, different investigators, different victims. Yet the signs were there. The rope, the stabbing, the meticulous method. It would take time, evidence, and a small but critical mistake on Joubert's part to finally connect the dots. For the families in Maine, the loss of young Ricky Stetson was devastating. Just as in Bellevue, the community recoiled in fear. Parents warned their children never to jog alone. The case remained unsolved, but the whispers of a serial predator grew louder. As 1984 drew to a close, Joubert's secret life remained intact. He had killed 3 boys in 2 different states, yet continued to pass as an ordinary young man in uniform. His crimes were brutal, his planning meticulous, and his ability to hide his darkness chillingly effective. But the rope he used, the bite marks he left behind, and his obsessive patterns were threads investigators would not forget. Those threads, though invisible to the towns he haunted, would eventually weave together to reveal the Boy Scout killer's true identity. For now, however, in 1984, the predator still walked free. In 1983 and 1984, while families in Nebraska and Maine mourned the losses of their children, the man responsible for those crimes walked among ordinary people, blending into daily life. His name was John Joseph Joubert, but to neighbors, classmates, and fellow servicemen, he was just John. Polite, disciplined, and seemingly ordinary. Yet inside his mind existed a storm few could imagine. From childhood, Joubert had felt different. He grew up in Lawrence, Massachusetts, in a family marked by tension and instability. His father left when he was still a boy, leaving his mother to raise him. John was quiet, intelligent, and shy. But at an early age, he began to harbor disturbing fantasies. By adolescence, those thoughts became actions. At age 13, he attacked another boy with a knife, stabbing him in the arm. The victim survived, but the violence was brushed aside, treated as the mistake of a troubled youth. A year later, he struck again, this time cutting another boy's throat. Fortunately, shallow enough not to be fatal. Authorities intervened, but Joubert was never fully treated. His compulsions deepened, hidden beneath the surface. What made Joubert particularly dangerous was his intelligence and his ability to mask his darkness. He studied people carefully. He knew how to smile, how to seem trustworthy. When he joined the Boy Scouts, he excelled, earning the highest rank of Eagle Scout. Parents trusted him, seeing only the uniform, the discipline, the promise of a good future. None suspected that the badge of honor concealed a predatory soul. When he later joined the Air Force, the same pattern repeated. Discipline, structure, and authority gave him the appearance of stability. To fellow recruits, he was neat and polite. To his officers, he was dependable. But inside, the fantasies never stopped. Joubert confessed years later that he carried a constant battle within himself. A part of him desperately wanted to resist, but the darker side always won. Psychologists who studied him after his arrest described a man driven by compulsions he could not fully explain. He admitted that he felt excitement in stalking children, a sense of control in binding them with ropes, and release in the violence that followed. He did not kill in chaos. He killed with method, with ritual. The ropes, the knots, the knives. Each was carefully chosen, as if his crimes were rehearsed. This duality, the trusted scout and soldier on the outside, the predator on the inside, made him invisible to those around him. Parents allowed him near their children. Fellow airmen joked with him casually. No one saw the storm behind his calm eyes. What is chilling is how Joubert himself recognized his abnormality. He once admitted in therapy sessions that he feared he was losing control, that his urges were consuming him. And yet, even with this awareness, he never stopped. The compulsions were too powerful, and the murders too satisfying to the dark side of his mind. By 1984, 3 boys had already died by his hand. Danny and Christopher in Nebraska, and Ricky in Maine. Yet Joubert went about daily life as though nothing had happened. He worked, trained, and even volunteered in scouting activities. His secret world remained locked behind an ordinary face. For investigators, the lack of a suspect profile was maddening. They searched for men with criminal histories, for outsiders drifting through town. Few would have looked at a young airman or an Eagle Scout. Joubert hid in plain sight, protected by the very image of trustworthiness. The psychology of his crimes, however, left a trail. The rope burns, the bite marks, the careful choice of victims. All boys, all young, all vulnerable, pointed to a predator with specific desires. It was only a matter of time before investigators connected the patterns. But in 1983 and 1984, that connection had not yet been made. And so the darkness remained hidden, shielded by a uniform, while the storm in Joubert's mind grew stronger. In late 1984 and into 1985, fear lingered heavily over Bellevue, Nebraska, and Portland, Maine. Families who had lost children lived in grief, while other parents struggled with constant anxiety. 2 towns, separated by more than 1,000 miles, had experienced eerily similar crimes. Boys abducted, bound with rope, stabbed, and left in remote areas. The public did not yet know these tragedies were connected. But the investigators were beginning to sense a pattern. In Nebraska, detectives continued to pore over the murders of Danny Joe Eberly and Christopher Walden. They studied the ropes used to bind the boys, noting the knots. The binding was not crude. It was deliberate, clean, and consistent. Whoever had tied those knots understood rope work with precision. Some officers suggested a military background, while others thought of scouting or survival training. Meanwhile, in Maine, investigators worked on the murder of Richard "Ricky" Stetson. The crime scene presented something unique: bite marks on the victim's body. Forensic odontologists, specialists in dental evidence, took molds of the marks. They knew that human bite patterns are nearly as distinct as fingerprints. If they ever found a suspect, they could match the teeth. For now, it was a piece of evidence waiting for its owner. The FBI became more involved as the murders drew national attention. Agents created a psychological profile of the killer, likely a young man in his 20s, intelligent, organized, and methodical, someone who could gain the trust of children quickly, possibly involved in Boy Scouts or the military, given the precision of the knots. A man living with deep compulsions, unable to resist his urges. This profile was hauntingly accurate. But investigators had no name, no face, no direct suspect. The community pressure was enormous. Parents demanded answers. News outlets carried the story, and both Nebraska and Maine police forces struggled under the weight of expectation. Yet the killer remained invisible. What no one realized was that John Joseph Joubert lived quietly within the military ranks in Maine, carrying out his duties as an airman while hiding his crimes in the shadows. To his peers, he was normal. To his superiors, he was disciplined. He moved without suspicion, confident that the image of a soldier would shield him from doubt. But cracks were beginning to form. Joubert could not silence his compulsions. He stalked children near the base, lingering in neighborhoods, driving slowly by schools. His behavior, though subtle, began to draw attention. On one occasion, residents noted a young man in a tan car circling near children. A description was passed along to authorities. It was vague, but it was something. In Nebraska, evidence from the rope used on Danny and Christopher was sent to specialized labs. Analysts discovered that the rope was not ordinary. It was a military-issued cord, the type often found on bases or among servicemen. The discovery narrowed the field. Investigators began to quietly consider military connections. In Maine, the bite mark evidence sat waiting. The strange impression in Ricky's skin would later prove decisive. But in 1985, the case was still unsolved, and Joubert still believed he was safe. What saved the investigation from collapse was persistence. Detectives refused to close the cases. They collected every lead, no matter how small. The FBI circulated the profile across states, warning that a predator was likely moving between communities. It was one of the earliest instances of law enforcement beginning to understand the cross-state patterns of serial killers. As 1985 progressed, the pressure on Joubert unknowingly grew. He was still young, still living with uncontrollable urges, and still leaving behind small traces of himself with every crime. His confidence that he could remain hidden would not last forever, and soon one small mistake, a detail he could not control, would begin to unravel his disguise. In January 1986, after years of fear, grief, and unanswered questions, the hunt for the predator who had terrorized Nebraska and Maine began to close in. The rope evidence, the bite marks, and the mounting suspicions all converged, leading detectives toward the young airman who had hidden in plain sight. For Bellevue police, the murders of Danny Joe Eberly and Christopher Walden were still active investigations. They had studied the rope bindings in detail, and now they knew. The cord used to tie the boys was a specific military issue, a type of rope not commonly found in civilian households. This discovery narrowed the search considerably. Investigators began watching for servicemen in the community who fit the FBI's profile. Meanwhile, in Maine, the unsolved murder of Richard "Ricky" Stetson remained open. The bite mark evidence, carefully preserved, was waiting for the day a suspect would be caught. That day was approaching. Detectives in Bellevue began to notice a young man driving slowly around neighborhoods, his car passing schools and playgrounds. The reports matched a tan car previously described by local residents. When questioned, the driver identified himself. Airman John Joseph Joubert, stationed at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. At first, there was nothing extraordinary about him. He was only 22 years old, quiet, polite, respectful to authority. He seemed like the kind of man no one would suspect. But investigators had learned by then that appearances could be deceiving. A search of Joubert's car and living quarters revealed chilling discoveries. In his possession, police found knives, ropes, and a collection of crime-related literature. More disturbingly, they discovered drawings, sketches depicting bound and gagged boys, images echoing the real-life crimes. Each page was a window into his compulsions, revealing the violent fantasies that had consumed him since adolescence. The rope matched. The knives matched. And when dental impressions were taken, the FBI confirmed the bite marks on Ricky Stetson's body were a perfect match to Joubert's teeth. The facade was over. On January 11, 1986, John Joseph Joubert was arrested. The quiet young airman, the proud Eagle Scout, the seemingly disciplined soldier, was in truth the predator who had haunted 2 states. News of his arrest shocked both Nebraska and Maine. Families wept in relief and horror. Parents who had feared for their children's safety finally had an answer. The community, once consumed by suspicion and whispers, could now put a name and a face to the shadow that had stalked them. When confronted with the evidence, Joubert confessed. He admitted to abducting and murdering Danny and Christopher in Nebraska, as well as Ricky in Maine. His words were calm, chilling in their simplicity. There was no madness in his tone, no rage. Only the cold recounting of a man who had surrendered to his compulsions. For investigators, the arrest was both a victory and a haunting realization. They had stopped a predator, but only after 3 young lives had been lost. Joubert's double life became clear to the public. A trusted Boy Scout leader and disciplined airman on one side, a calculating serial killer on the other. The contrast was almost too much to comprehend. Parents who had once taught their children that the sight of a scout or a soldier meant safety now struggled with a new truth. Evil could wear even the most trusted uniforms. The trial ahead would reveal even more about Joubert's psychology, his compulsions, and the way he had hidden in plain sight. But for now, in 1986, the town of Bellevue could finally exhale. The Boy Scout killer was in custody. In 1987, the state of Nebraska prepared to bring John Joseph Joubert to trial. For the families of the victims, this was the moment they had waited for. The chance to hear the truth in a court of law. To see justice delivered for the stolen lives of Danny Joe Eberly and Christopher Walden. Joubert's arrest in 1986 had shocked the community, but the trial would uncover even more unsettling details about his life, his compulsions, and his cold, methodical violence. Inside the courtroom, Joubert appeared calm, almost detached. Dressed in standard prison attire, he did not fit the image of a monster. To those who looked at him, he was young, almost ordinary, soft-spoken, even respectful. But behind that quiet exterior lay the chilling confessions of a man who had murdered 3 children in 2 states. The prosecution presented their evidence piece by piece. The rope fibers from the bodies of Danny and Christopher matched the rope found in Joubert's possession. The knives discovered in his car and quarters matched the wounds on the victims. And most damning of all, dental experts testified that the bite marks on Ricky Stetson in Maine were a perfect match to Joubert's teeth. There was no denying the link. Science had spoken, and the connection was undeniable. But what shocked many was Joubert's own confession. He admitted to the killings with disturbing clarity, describing how he had stalked his victims, lured them in, bound them with ropes, and carried out the murders. His words were clinical, devoid of emotion. To the court, it was as if he were describing something routine, not the destruction of young lives. Psychologists were brought in to testify about his mental state. They explained how Joubert had struggled with sadistic compulsions since adolescence. He admitted that he felt a surge of excitement when stalking and binding children, and that the killings gave him a sense of control he could not resist. One psychologist described him as a man trapped between 2 worlds. One side intelligent, organized, and capable of discipline. The other consumed by urges so powerful that no amount of reason or morality could stop them. The defense attempted to argue for mental illness, suggesting Joubert's compulsions diminished his responsibility. They painted him as a man tormented by urges he never asked for, a man who even feared himself. But the jury and the families who sat in that courtroom saw things differently. Whatever his inner battles, Joubert had made choices. Choices that destroyed innocent lives. For the families, the testimony was unbearable. They listened as the details of their children's last moments were laid bare. They saw photographs, heard about the bindings, and relived the horror they had tried to escape since 1983. Some broke down in tears. Others sat in silence, holding tightly to one another. By the end of 1987, the jury reached its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The evidence was overwhelming, the crimes undeniable. The court sentenced John Joseph Joubert to death in Nebraska. But the story did not end there. In Maine, authorities prepared their own case for the murder of Ricky Stetson. The bite mark evidence alone was powerful enough, but now, with Joubert's confession, the case was stronger than ever. In 1988, Maine's legal system confirmed what Nebraska had already decided. Joubert was guilty beyond doubt. For the first time in years, the families of Danny, Christopher, and Ricky felt a measure of justice. Their children's killer would never walk free again. Yet the trial also left the public with haunting questions. How could a young man who achieved the rank of Eagle Scout, who wore the uniform of the U.S. Air Force, commit such atrocities? How could someone so outwardly normal harbor such hidden darkness? The courtroom revealed a painful truth. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind the very symbols of trust, waiting for the moment to strike. As the trial concluded and Joubert was led back to his cell, the shadow he had cast over Bellevue and Maine began to lift. But for the families, the scars would never fully heal. In 1989, after the trials in Nebraska and Maine had ended, John Joseph Joubert began the final chapter of his life. The Boy Scout killer was locked away inside the Nebraska State Penitentiary, sentenced to death for the murders of Danny Joe Eberly and Christopher Walden, and forever linked to the killing of Ricky Stetson in Maine. For many in Bellevue and Portland, there was relief. The man who had terrorized their towns could no longer harm another child. But his story did not end with the clang of a prison cell. For nearly 7 years, Joubert lived on death row, confined, observed, and studied. Inside prison, Joubert continued to maintain the strange duality that had marked his entire life. To guards and staff, he was respectful, obedient, and soft-spoken. He followed the rules, avoided confrontation, and carried himself with calm discipline. He did not lash out. He did not cause trouble. To those who only saw the surface, he could have been mistaken for an ordinary inmate, resigned to his fate. But beneath that calm exterior, the same compulsions churned within. Psychologists who interviewed Joubert during his years on death row described a man who fully understood his crimes, who recognized his compulsions, but who admitted that if ever released, he feared he would kill again. He spoke candidly about his urges, acknowledging that they were part of him, unshakable, unstoppable. He described his fantasies in chilling detail. He explained how the act of stalking boys gave him excitement, how binding them with ropes gave him a sense of power, and how the violence itself brought release. His words were cold, matter-of-fact, never hysterical, never emotional. To those who listened, it was as if he were recounting the steps of a routine he could not stop repeating. In his cell, Joubert kept writings and drawings. Some were reflections on his crimes, while others were disturbingly graphic sketches of children bound and gagged, echoing the crimes he had committed. These writings were later used to better understand the psychology of sadistic killers. For criminologists, Joubert became a case study, an example of how a seemingly normal young man could harbor such violent compulsions. For the families of his victims, however, these details were unbearable reminders. They knew he was alive, eating meals, breathing air, while their sons were gone forever. They waited through the slow grind of appeals, hoping that one day justice would truly be carried out. Throughout these years, Joubert's lawyers fought to save him from execution. They argued that his mental illness should spare his life, that his compulsions made him sick rather than evil. Appeals were filed, hearings scheduled, delays granted. Each time, the families of Danny and Christopher were forced to sit through new proceedings, reopening old wounds. But the courts consistently upheld the sentence. The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions undeniable, the crimes too brutal. Whatever his inner compulsions, Joubert had acted with deliberate control. He had stalked, planned, abducted, and killed, and for that, the courts maintained, he must face the ultimate penalty. In the small hours of prison life, Joubert lived with the knowledge of his fate. Guards later reported that he showed little outward fear of death. He read, he wrote, and he waited. But in his private moments, he confided to psychologists that he did not want to die, that despite his crimes, he clung to life. For nearly 7 years, the families waited too. They visited graves, mourned birthdays that never came, and lived with empty chairs at dinner tables. Every day of Joubert's appeals was another day of pain, another reminder that their sons were gone. By the mid-1990s, after exhausting every legal avenue, the final date was set. Nebraska prepared to carry out its first execution by lethal injection, and the man who would mark that moment in history was John Joseph Joubert. In July 1996, after nearly a decade of appeals and hearings, the long path of justice reached its conclusion. The state of Nebraska prepared to carry out the sentence imposed years earlier. The execution of John Joseph Joubert, the Boy Scout killer. By this time, Joubert was 33 years old. He had spent almost a third of his life behind the walls of the Nebraska State Penitentiary, confined to death row. For the families of Danny Joe Eberly and Christopher Walden, the day brought a mixture of emotions, grief, sorrow, and a sense of final justice. For them, this was not about revenge. It was about closure, about ensuring the man who had stolen their children's lives could never harm again. The execution was scheduled for the morning of July 17th, 1996. Unlike earlier decades when Nebraska had carried out executions by electric chair, this would mark the state's first use of lethal injection, a method seen as quieter, less violent, more clinical. Joubert, ironically, would make history once again. Not as a scout, not as a soldier, but as the first man in Nebraska to die by the needle. In the days leading up to the execution, Joubert remained calm. Guards described him as quiet and resigned, though he occasionally spoke of fear. He wrote letters, some to family, some reflecting on his crimes. There were no dramatic outbursts, no frantic pleas. He had exhausted every legal appeal, and he knew the end was near. On the morning of July 17th, witnesses gathered at the penitentiary. Among them were journalists, state officials, and members of the victims' families. Each carried heavy emotions, some hoping for peace, others still torn by grief. The execution chamber was sterile, brightly lit, a far cry from the dark woods where Joubert had carried out his murders. At approximately 12:23 a.m., guards led Joubert into the chamber. He was strapped to a gurney, his arms extended. The intravenous lines were inserted. The room was silent, save for the steady hum of machinery. Joubert offered no final words, only a quiet acknowledgment of the process. The drugs flowed. First to render him unconscious, then to stop his breathing, and finally to halt his heart. Within minutes, the man who had brought terror to Bellevue and Portland lay still. At 12:34 a.m., John Joseph Joubert was pronounced dead. For some witnesses, the moment felt anticlimactic. The quiet efficiency of lethal injection did not erase the pain of the past. But for the families, it marked the end of a long chapter. Their sons could not be returned, but their killer was gone forever. News of the execution spread quickly. Across Nebraska and Maine, headlines reported the end of the Boy Scout killer. Commentators reflected on the disturbing duality of Joubert's life. A decorated Eagle Scout, a disciplined airman, and yet a sadistic murderer. Criminologists studied his case for years afterward, using it to understand the psychology of child predators and serial killers. For the small town of Bellevue, the execution brought a sense of release. Parents no longer whispered the name in fear. The community, scarred by grief, slowly began to heal. But the story of John Joseph Joubert remains a haunting reminder. Evil can wear the mask of trust, and danger can hide in the most ordinary faces. After 1996, when John Joseph Joubert was executed, the case left behind more than just the memory of his crimes. It became a turning point in how communities, investigators, and psychologists understood hidden predators. For the families of Danny Joe Eberly, Christopher Walden, and Ricky Stetson, the pain never truly ended. No sentence, no punishment, No execution could erase the empty space left by their children. But their stories became warnings, reminders that even in quiet suburban towns, danger can lurk close to home. In Nebraska, Bellevue would never be the same. Before 1983, it was a community where parents trusted their children to ride bikes and deliver newspapers freely. After Joubert, those assumptions of safety were shattered. Families became more cautious, protective, and aware. The town rebuilt itself, but it carried the scars of what had happened. In Maine, the memory of Ricky's murder changed the way investigators looked at evidence. The bite mark that matched Joubert's teeth became one of the most famous cases of forensic odontology, showing how dental evidence could help convict killers. Even years later, criminology students studied the case as an example of science catching what the human eye could not. Law enforcement also learned lessons. The killings showed the importance of interstate cooperation. Joubert had murdered in Nebraska and Maine, two states separated by over 1,000 miles. Without communication, the cases might never have been linked. His crimes helped push police toward better sharing of information across jurisdictions, paving the way for modern systems that track serial offenders nationwide. Psychologists, too, studied Joubert as a textbook case of hidden sadism. He was young, intelligent, disciplined, and outwardly normal. He had achieved Eagle Scout rank, worn the uniform of the U.S. Air Force, and gained the trust of those around him. Yet beneath that exterior lived violent compulsions he could not resist. Experts saw in him the terrifying truth that outward respectability does not guarantee safety, and that predators often wear masks of trust. Even today, his story is remembered as one of betrayal. The Boy Scouts, an institution built on values of honor and responsibility, carried the stain of his actions. Parents who once saw the uniform as a symbol of safety now questioned it. Joubert's crimes reminded the world that symbols, no matter how noble, can be corrupted. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Joubert case is the reminder it left for communities everywhere. Vigilance matters. Evil does not always appear in the form of a stranger lurking in shadows. Sometimes it wears a smile, earns badges, serves in uniform, and walks unnoticed through neighborhoods. For the families, the execution brought closure, but not peace. Their children's names are remembered not for their deaths, but for their lives. Danny, Christopher, Ricky, three boys whose innocence was stolen, but whose stories helped others learn and stay safe. And so, the story of John Joseph Joubert is more than just the tale of a killer. It is a warning, a history, a reminder that even in the calmest of places, shadows may linger. You have been listening to Sleeping Radio, where the stories of the past unfold slowly, guiding you into the quiet of the night. Tonight, we told the story of John Joseph Joubert, the Boy Scout killer, a young man who hid behind uniforms of trust, yet carried within him urges that led to tragedy. From the small town of Bellevue in 1983, to the courtroom in 1987, to the execution chamber in 1996, his shadow stretched across families, communities, and history. But while the man is gone, the lessons remain. The importance of vigilance, the resilience of families, and the reminder that even in the darkest stories, light comes through when truth is revealed. Now, as the story fades, let your eyes grow heavy, your breath slow, and your thoughts drift away. For the world of shadows is past, and the silence of the night belongs to you. Good night.